"Ma'am, if you don't board now, you'll be left behind." The voice cut through the terminal noise like a final warning, sharp and practiced, the kind that didn't repeat itself twice. But Emily Carter didn't move. Not when the line surged forward, not when the scanner beeped again, not even when the gate agent's eyes narrowed with quiet impatience. Because just a few feet away, near the wide glass windows overlooking the runway, a man was on the floor, and no one was stopping, no one was kneeling. No one was even slowing down. They just stepped around him like he was a misplaced bag or a spill someone else would handle. And for a second, Emily thought maybe she was wrong. Maybe he had tripped and would get up. Maybe someone closer would help. But then she saw his hand, slightly curled against the polished tile, unmoving, and something in her chest tightened in a way that didn't ask for permission. The overhead lights reflected off the floor in cold strips. The distant roar of a departing jet trembled through the glass, and still the line kept moving. A man in a gray suit muttered under his breath as he passed. Probably had too much to drink, barely glancing down. And the woman behind him adjusted her carry-on, careful not to let the wheels touch the man's shoe. As if inconvenience was the only real concern in the room, Emily's fingers tightened around her boarding pass, the thin paper already creased from being checked twice. Her flight number blinking on the screen above the gate. Final call, the letters flashing in steady rhythm. Her heart synced with it for a moment. Fast, uncertain, and then she looked again, really looked, at the man's face, at the stillness that didn't match the noise around him, at the way his chest barely moved under his simple jacket, and suddenly the gate, the flight, the carefully planned schedule of her life felt distant, like something happening behind glass. The scanner beeped again, louder this time. The agent gestured firmly, "Ma'am." But Emily's feet didn't follow, they stayed rooted in that narrow space between leaving and staying, between being another passenger and being the only one who saw him as something more than an inconvenience. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadies you right before everything changes, and then, without announcing it, without asking anyone for permission, she stepped out of line. The movement small but immediate, her suitcase wheels dragging softly behind her before she let go of the handle entirely, the bag tipping slightly as she walked away from the gate, each step louder in her own ears than the airport announcements echoing overhead. She could feel the eyes on her now, brief, curious, already forgetting, but she didn't look up, didn't explain, didn't hesitate. She crossed the polished floor and lowered herself beside him, the cold surface pressing through her jeans, her hand hovering for just a fraction of a second before gently touching his shoulder. "Sir." Her voice softer than the chaos around them, steady despite the tightness in her chest. And in that moment, as the final boarding call faded into silence behind her, Emily Carter made a choice no one else in that terminal was willing to make. She stayed. Emily kept her hand on his shoulder, steady and warm against the cool fabric of his jacket, as if that small point of contact could anchor him back to the moment. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked again, her voice calm even though her pulse had not slowed since she stepped out of line. The man's breathing was shallow but present, a faint rise and fall that reassured her just enough to stay focused. She glanced up quickly, scanning the moving crowd. "Can someone call for medical assistance?" But the words seemed to dissolve into the air, swallowed by rolling suitcases and distant announcements. A few people looked over, then away, their steps never breaking rhythm, and for a brief second doubt brushed against her thoughts. Not regret, but that quiet question people ask when they step outside the expected path. What now? What if no one comes? What if she had made a choice that led nowhere? But she pushed it aside and reached into her bag, pulling out her phone with practiced hands, dialing emergency services as she kept her eyes on him, describing the situation in clear, measured sentences, her tone steady in contrast to the noise around her. When she ended the call, she shifted slightly closer, lowering her voice again. "Help is on the way. You are not alone." The words simple, not dramatic, just present. His eyelids flickered faintly, a small movement that most would miss, but Emily saw it, and it was enough to keep her grounded. She adjusted her position so he could breathe more easily, remembering something she had once read, something small and practical that suddenly felt important. The floor beneath her felt colder now, pressing into her knees, but she did not move away. Behind her, the gate area had grown quieter. The final boarding call had ended. replaced by the distant hum of another flight preparing to leave. She did not turn to look. She did not need confirmation. She already knew. Her flight was gone. The path she had planned for that day had closed without her. And yet, sitting there, she did not feel lost, just still, like everything had narrowed to this one moment. A security officer finally approached, his steps slower than she expected, eyes assessing the situation with routine caution. "What happened here?" he asked, and Emily answered calmly, giving only what she knew. No assumptions, no urgency in her tone beyond what was necessary. As if staying composed would somehow hold the moment together. The officer nodded and spoke into his radio, his voice low and controlled. And within minutes, though it felt longer, 2 medical staff members arrived with quiet efficiency, kneeling beside the man, asking brief questions, checking his pulse, their presence shifting the energy of the space from indifference to attention. Emily leaned back slightly to give them room, but her hand lingered near his arm, not fully pulling away. One of the responders glanced at her. "Did you stay with him the whole time?" And she nodded, not thinking it was anything unusual, just the only thing that made sense. The man's breathing steadied under their care, his face no longer as pale as before, and as they prepared to move him onto a stretcher, his hand shifted slightly, brushing against hers for a brief second, not fully conscious, not intentional, but real enough that she felt it. And in that fleeting contact, something unspoken passed. Between them, not gratitude yet, not recognition, just connection, simple and human. And as they lifted him carefully, guiding him away through the corridor that had once ignored him, Emily finally exhaled fully, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, the tension easing in a way she had not noticed building. The terminal resumed its rhythm around her, footsteps, announcements, distant engines. Everything continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Emily, something had already changed, even if she could not yet name it. Emily stood slowly after the stretcher disappeared around the corner, her knees stiff from the cold floor, her fingers still holding the faint memory of that brief contact as if it had weight, as if something had passed through it that words could not explain. She looked down at her hands for a second before reaching for her suitcase, lifting it upright with a quiet motion that felt heavier than before, not because of the weight, but because of everything that had just shifted inside her. The terminal had already moved on, people walking, laughing, checking screens, the world continuing with its practiced indifference. And for a moment she just stood there, caught between what had just happened and what was supposed to happen next. A nearby screen flickered with updated departures. Her flight no longer listed under boarding, now marked simply as departed. The words sat there without emotion, flat and final. And she let out a small breath through her nose. Not regret, not frustration, just acceptance settling quietly into place. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and turned away from the gate. Her steps slower now, not rushed, not driven by a schedule anymore, just moving because standing still would keep her in that moment too long. She passed rows of empty seats and charging stations, the glow of phone screens reflecting in tired faces, the smell of coffee drifting from a nearby kiosk, familiar, ordinary, grounding, and yet everything felt slightly different. Like the air had shifted just enough for her to notice. She found a seat near the window, away from the main flow of passengers, and sat down, placing her suitcase beside her. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a notification she had not checked, an email from her former employer, the subject line still unopened, still carrying the quiet weight of a life that had already started to unravel before she even reached the airport. She stared at it for a second, then locked the screen without reading it. As if that version of her day no longer held the same urgency. Outside the window, planes moved slowly along the runway, guided by lights and signals invisible to most people, each one following a path already set, precise, predictable, and she wondered, not for the first time, how many people followed paths like that without ever questioning where they led. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, faint against the movement outside, tired eyes, steady expression, nothing remarkable, nothing that would make anyone stop and look twice. And yet today, she had been the only one who stopped, the only one who stayed. The thought did not make her feel special, just aware of how easy it was to walk past something that mattered, how simple it was to choose convenience over compassion, A voice came over the intercom announcing delays on another flight, the words blending into the background like white noise, and she leaned back slightly in her seat, letting the sound wash over her, her mind replaying the moment on the floor, the stillness, the silence around him, the way people had looked without seeing, and then the way his breathing had steadied. The subtle shift that told her he was going to be okay. She did not know his name, did not know anything about him beyond those few minutes. But something about it lingered, something unfinished, like a sentence that had not reached its end. A woman sat down a few seats away, typing quickly on a laptop, focused, efficient, already moving forward, and Emily watched her for a second before looking away, her own pace different now, slower, more deliberate. As if she had stepped out of a current that most people never noticed they were in, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of water, taking a sip, the cool liquid grounding her further in the present. And as she sat there, no longer rushing, no longer chasing a schedule, she realized something quietly, something that did not need to be spoken out loud. That missing that flight had not taken something from her. It had revealed something about who she was when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain. And as the afternoon light shifted across the glass, soft and steady, Emily Carter sat in that space between where she had been and where she was going next, not knowing yet that the moment she thought had ended on that airport floor was only just beginning. Emily checked the time without urgency, the numbers on her phone no longer dictating her next move. Just existing, just passing. And for a while she sat there watching planes taxi in slow, deliberate lines, each one guided, each one expected somewhere, until a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her pulled her attention back inside the terminal. It was not loud at first, not dramatic, just a change in movement, the kind that starts quietly and then spreads, a few airport staff walking faster than before, their expressions focused, clipped voices passing between radios, a security officer from earlier reappearing in the corridor, now standing straighter, more alert, and Emily noticed it without fully understanding why. Her eyes followed the motion instinctively, the way people do when something feels different before they know what it is. A pair of men in dark suits moved past her, not running, not rushing, but with a purpose that cut through the casual flow of travelers, one of them speaking low into a phone. Yes, he is stable. They are moving him now. The words were brief, controlled, but they lingered in the air just long enough for Emily to catch them. Her fingers tightened slightly around the bottle of water in her hand. Not fear, not concern, just recognition. They were talking about him, the man from the floor, and for the first time since she sat down, something pulled her forward again. Not obligation, not responsibility, just a quiet need to know that he was all right. She stood slowly, her suitcase rolling beside her as she stepped back into the flow of the terminal, following the direction the men had gone without making it obvious, without drawing attention, just moving with a subtle intention beneath her calm exterior. The corridor ahead opened into a quieter section of the airport, less crowded, more controlled, and as she approached, she could see a small cluster of people gathered near a restricted access point, medical staff, security, and those same suited figures forming a loose perimeter, their presence calm but unmistakably protective. Emily stopped a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to disconnect, just within sight, just enough to see that he was there, now on a stretcher, being guided carefully through the secured doorway, his face no longer as pale, his breathing steady, monitored, the tension in her chest eased in a way she had not noticed building again. She exhaled quietly, almost to herself, and turned slightly, ready to step away now that she knew. But then something unexpected happened. One of the suited men paused, his eyes scanning the area with quick precision before landing on her, not by accident, not by chance, but with a kind of recognition that made her hesitate. He said something quietly to the man beside him, and within seconds, another figure approached her, a woman this time, composed, professional, her posture straight, her voice low but direct. "Excuse me, were you the one who stayed with him?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight Emily did not fully understand yet. She nodded once, unsure why it mattered. The woman studied her for a brief moment, not judging, not questioning, just confirming something internally. Then she gave a small, respectful nod in return. "Thank you," she said, the words measured, genuine, and then turned back toward the group, leaving Emily standing there with a feeling she could not quite place, not pride, not confusion, something quieter, something unfolding just beneath the surface. The restricted doors closed softly as the stretcher disappeared from view, the suited figures following behind, their presence leaving a noticeable absence in the space they vacated. And for a moment, the corridor returned to its neutral stillness, as if nothing significant had just passed through it. But Emily remained where she was for a second longer, her mind catching up to what her instincts had already sensed. That this was not ordinary, that the man she had helped was not just another traveler passing through unnoticed. And as she finally turned back toward the main terminal, her steps slow and thoughtful, she carried with her the quiet certainty that something larger than a missed flight had just begun to take shape around her, something she had stepped into without realizing, simply by choosing not to walk away. Emily walked back into the main terminal, but the rhythm of the place no longer felt the same. The noise was still there, the rolling suitcases, the overhead announcements, the distant hum of planes, but it all seemed slightly muted, like she was hearing it from behind glass, her mind replaying the moment in the corridor, the way those people moved, the way they spoke, the way they looked at him, not with indifference, but with something closer to urgency and respect, and it did not fit with the image she had first seen on the floor. A man ignored, stepped around, dismissed without a second glance. She slowed near a seating area, her suitcase wheels turning softly as she stopped again, watching the flow of travelers without really seeing them, trying to place the disconnect in her mind. A voice nearby broke through her thoughts, two airport employees standing near a service desk, speaking in low tones that were not meant to carry but did anyway. "I heard it was him," one said, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one important was within earshot. The other shook his head slightly. "No way, he does not travel like that." The first one leaned in closer, voice dropping even lower. They said it was Marcus Reed. The name landed in the air between them, quiet but heavy, and Emily felt it before she understood it. A shift, subtle but immediate. The second employee straightened, his expression tightening with disbelief. "The Marcus Reed?" he asked, and the first one nodded once. "Owner of the airline," he said, almost under his breath, as if saying it too loudly might change something. Emily's grip on her suitcase handle tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity forming in her mind. She did not move, did not interrupt, just stood there as the pieces began to align. The suited men, the controlled urgency, the way the woman had asked her that question with such quiet intention. It all settled into place without needing confirmation, and yet her mind resisted it for a second, not because it was impossible, but because it felt so distant from the moment she had experienced. The man on the floor had not looked like power. He had not carried the presence of someone people feared or admired. He had simply looked human, vulnerable, overlooked, and that contrast pressed against her thoughts in a way that made her chest tighten slightly. The employees moved away, their conversation already fading into the background. But the name stayed, echoing quietly in her mind. Marcus Reed. She let it sit there, turning it over without urgency, without attaching anything to it yet, just letting the realization settle at its own pace. She looked back toward the corridor where he had been taken, now empty, ordinary again, and for a moment she imagined what would have happened if she had stayed in line, if she had boarded her flight, if she had let that moment pass like everyone else had. The thought did not feel dramatic. It felt simple. She would never have known, never have questioned, never have stepped into whatever this was becoming. A quiet voice in her mind reminded her that it should not matter who he was, that her choice had not been about status or recognition. And she held on to that, firmly, because it was true. She had not stayed because of who he might be. She had stayed because no one else did. And yet, standing there now, knowing what she knew, the situation shifted in a way she could not ignore, not because it changed her action, but because it revealed something about everyone else, about how quickly people decided who was worth seeing and who was not. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as the tension settled into something quieter, something more reflective. And as she turned toward the large windows again, watching another plane lift into the sky with steady force, she understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that the moment on that floor had never been about power. It had been about presence, about choosing to see someone when the world decided not to, and now, with the truth beginning to surface around her, she could feel the weight of that choice in a different way, not heavier, just deeper, as if what she thought had been a small, passing moment was unfolding into something far larger than she had ever intended. Emily did not return to the gate this time. Instead, she moved toward a quieter corner of the terminal where the noise softened into a distant hum, a place where the light from the tall windows stretched across the floor in long, pale lines. She set her suitcase down beside an empty chair and remained standing for a moment, as if sitting would make everything settle too quickly. Her mind was not racing. It was slow, deliberate, turning over the same realization again and again, not with shock, but with quiet clarity. Marcus Reed. The name no longer felt distant. It felt real, attached now to the man whose breathing she had watched, whose hand had barely moved against hers. She closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape the moment, but to return to it, to the stillness of the floor, to the silence around him, to the way no one had stopped, and she realized something that settled deeper than the name itself, that if he had remained just another traveler, just another man no one recognized, nothing about that moment would have changed for her. She would have still knelt, still stayed, still missed that flight without hesitation. The thought did not come with pride, it came with certainty, the kind that does not need to be defended. She opened her eyes again and slowly sat down, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her breathing even. Outside the window, a plane lifted into the sky, its engines low and steady, disappearing into a pale afternoon horizon, and she watched it without following it, without imagining herself on it. The path she had missed no longer felt like something lost, it felt like something released, a different kind of direction unfolding without noise or announcement. Her phone buzzed again, another notification, another reminder of a life that had been structured by expectations and schedules. She picked it up this time, not to check messages, but to silence it completely, pressing the screen dark, choosing quiet over interruption. The terminal around her continued its rhythm, people moving, voices rising and falling, but in her space, there was a pause, a stillness that held its own kind of weight. She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting to the reflections in the glass, overlapping images of movement and sky, and in that layered view, she saw something that felt almost symbolic, how easily things overlapped, how perception shifted depending on where you stood. The man on the floor had been one image, the name she heard was another, and somewhere between those two was the truth, not about who he was in the world, but who he had been in that moment, just a person in need of someone to stop. A soft exhale left her lips, almost a release, and for the first time since everything had unfolded, she allowed herself to feel the quiet emotion beneath it all, not overwhelm, not confusion, but something gentler, something closer to understanding. She had not changed the world by staying. She had not done anything extraordinary by her own measure. She had simply refused to walk past, and yet, that small refusal had opened something, not just for him, but for her, a shift in how she saw the space around her, how she understood the people moving through it, how thin the line was between being seen and being invisible. Her fingers traced lightly along the edge of her suitcase handle, a grounding motion, familiar and steady. And as the light outside softened slightly, the shadows stretching longer across the terminal floor, Emily Carter sat in that quiet space with a sense of calm that did not need explanation, the kind that comes when a choice aligns perfectly with who you are, even when it changes everything around you. And in that stillness, without urgency or expectation, she waited, not for something to happen, but for whatever came next to find her. The shift did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in movement, subtle at first, then undeniable. Emily noticed it before she understood it. The way conversations lowered mid-sentence, the way a few heads turned in the same direction without being told, the way a pair of airport staff straightened their posture as if something important had entered the space. She followed their gaze without standing, her eyes tracing the line of sight across the terminal until it reached the far corridor, where restricted access met the public floor. And then she saw them, the same suited figures from before, but this time their formation was tighter, more deliberate, their presence no longer blending into the background, but quietly commanding the space around them. And at the center of that movement, Walking now instead of being carried was him, Marcus Reed, his steps measured, steady, one hand briefly brushing the side of the wall as if grounding himself in the motion, his expression calm but focused, not weak, not distant, just present. The difference from the man on the floor was not in his status. It was in the awareness around him. People noticed him now. They made space without being asked. They stepped aside with a kind of unspoken respect that had been completely absent before. Emily felt her breath pause for a fraction of a second, not because of who he was, but because of the contrast, the same man, the same presence, and yet the world had shifted around him entirely. He spoke quietly to one of the men beside him, his voice too low to carry, but his tone even, controlled. And then, as if guided by something unseen, his gaze lifted, scanning the terminal not with urgency, but with intention, and it stopped, not on the crowd, not on the staff, but on her. Emily felt it before she fully processed it, that direct line of attention, steady, unmistakable, and for a moment everything else softened, the movement, the noise, the passing announcements, it all fell into the background as that single point of connection held. She did not look away, not out of defiance, not out of expectation, just because it felt natural, the same way it had felt natural to kneel beside him earlier. Marcus slowed slightly, the people around him adjusting without question, and then he did something that broke the quiet choreography of authority. He stepped out of their formation, just one step, but enough to shift the balance. The suited figures hesitated for a fraction of a second before allowing it, their watchful eyes tracking his movement as he walked toward her, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. Emily stood as he approached, her posture instinctively straightening, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her heartbeat steady but aware. When he stopped a few feet in front of her, the space between them felt clear, unguarded. His expression softened slightly, not into a smile, but into something more genuine, something that held recognition. "You stayed," he said, his voice calm, deeper than she expected, carrying a quiet weight that did not need volume. Emily nodded once, the simplicity of the moment grounding her. "Yes," she replied, her tone just as steady. There was no need to explain, no need to justify. He studied her for a brief second, not evaluating, not measuring, just seeing, the kind of attention that felt different from the passing glances of strangers. No one else did. He added, not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact. And in that moment, the distance between who he was in the world and who he had been on that floor disappeared completely, leaving only two people standing in a quiet space, connected by a choice that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with presence. The terminal continued to move around them. But for Emily, the moment held still, not because of who he was, but because of what he saw. And for the first time since she had stepped out of that line, she understood that the moment had not ended when she stood up from the floor. It had been waiting, quietly, for this. Marcus did not rush to fill the silence after his words. He simply stood there, his presence steady, giving the moment space to exist without pressure. And Emily felt that immediately, the absence of expectation, the absence of performance. Just two people standing in the middle of a busy terminal that somehow no longer felt loud. "I should thank you properly," he said after a beat, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper now, not obligation, not formality, something closer to sincerity. Emily shook her head slightly before he could continue, the motion small but certain. "You do not owe me anything," she replied, her tone gentle, not dismissive, just honest, and for the first time since he had approached, a faint smile touched the edge of his expression, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to show that he understood exactly what she meant. "That is exactly why I do," he said quietly, the words settling between them without force. Behind him, the suited figures remained at a respectful distance, their attention present but unobtrusive, as if they understood that this moment was not something to interrupt. Marcus glanced briefly over his shoulder, then back at her, grounding himself again in the conversation. "You missed your flight," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of consequence. Emily nodded once. "Yes," she answered, and there was no regret in it, no hesitation, just fact. He studied her for a second longer, as if confirming something that went beyond the situation, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement slow, deliberate. He pulled out a simple card, not flashy, not heavy, just clean, minimal, and held it out toward her, not pushing it into her hand, just offering it. "Let me make that right," he said, his voice still even, still controlled, but carrying a quiet insistence that came not from power, but from intention. Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just considering. "I did not stay for that," she said softly, the words clear, grounded, and for a brief second. The space between them held a different kind of tension, not conflict, but truth meeting truth. Marcus did not withdraw the card, but he did not push it further either. He nodded once, acknowledging her without resistance. "I know," he replied, and that single sentence carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it meant he understood, not just what she did, but why she did it. The difference between reward and recognition, between transaction and connection. He lowered his hand slightly, but did not put the card away. Instead, he adjusted his stance, shifting the tone of the moment without breaking it. "Then do not take it as repayment," he continued, his voice softer now, more personal. "Take it as an invitation." Emily's eyes stayed on his, searching not for meaning, but for sincerity, and she found it, not in his words alone, but in the way he held the moment, without urgency, without pressure, just open. "An invitation to what?" she asked, her voice calm. Curious but measured, Marcus's expression eased just slightly, as if the question itself mattered more than the answer. "To not disappear after doing something that mattered," he said, the words quiet, but they landed with a depth that reached beyond the terminal, beyond the situation, into something more lasting. Emily felt that, not as a pull, not as a push, but as a possibility, something she had not planned, something she had not expected, and for a moment, she looked down at the card again, then back at him, her decision forming not from the situation, but from the same place her earlier choice had come from. Steady, grounded, she reached out and took it, not quickly, not reluctantly, just naturally, her fingers brushing lightly against his for a brief second. A small contact that carried none of the urgency from before, only awareness. Marcus nodded once more, a quiet acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of connection, and as he stepped back slightly, allowing the space to return to what it had been, the terminal noise began to rise again around them. But something had already shifted, not in the world, not in the crowd, but in the simple, undeniable understanding that this moment was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what could follow. Emily did not look at the card again right away. She simply held it between her fingers as Marcus stepped back into the quiet formation waiting for him, the suited figures closing in just enough to resume their silent coordination. But something about the way he moved had changed, not slower, not weaker, just more aware, as if the moment they had shared had settled into him the same way it had settled into her. He gave her one last nod, not formal, not distant, just real, and then turned, walking back toward the restricted corridor without urgency, without spectacle, the space around him shifting once more as people instinctively made room. And just like that, he was gone from her direct view, absorbed into the flow of a world that now recognized him. Emily stood there for a second longer, the noise of the terminal returning in layers, footsteps, voices, distant engines, all folding back into place as if nothing had paused at all. But she felt the difference, not around her. Within her, she looked down at the card in her hand. Simple, unassuming. A name, a number, nothing more, and yet it carried a weight that had nothing to do with status. She slipped it carefully into the side pocket of her bag, not as something to use, not as something to rely on, but as something to remember. She reached for her suitcase and began walking again, this time not drifting, not pausing, just moving forward with a quiet clarity that had not been there before. The large departure board ahead displayed the next set of flights, destinations shifting in, bright letters, times updating, paths continuing. She stopped in front of it, scanning without urgency, not looking for the fastest route, not chasing the next available seat, just choosing. Her hand moved to the touchscreen kiosk nearby, the glow reflecting softly against her face as she selected a new flight. Later, not rushed, giving herself space. The process simple, direct, A new boarding pass printing with a quiet mechanical hum. She took it, the paper warm for a brief second before cooling in her hand, a small, ordinary detail that grounded the moment. She glanced toward the gate listed, then started in that direction, her steps steady, measured, the same terminal, the same path, and yet it felt different, not because the place had changed, but because she had. As she walked, she passed people sitting, rushing, waiting, some absorbed in their screens, some lost in thought, and she noticed them in a way she had not before, not individually, not deeply, but with a broader awareness, as if each person carried a moment that could be seen or missed depending on who chose to stop. The light outside had softened into a warmer tone, late afternoon stretching toward evening, the reflections on the polished floor longer now, softer, and when she reached her new gate, she did not stand in line immediately. She paused near the window, setting her suitcase beside her once more, the plane outside being prepared slowly, methodically, its presence calm against the fading sky. She rested her hand lightly on the handle of her suitcase, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed. There was no urgency left in her movements, no pressure to catch up to something she had lost, because she understood now that she had not fallen behind. She had simply taken a different path, one that had not been scheduled, not been expected, but had been entirely hers. The boarding announcement began softly in the background, passengers gathering, forming a line, and after a moment, Emily stepped forward, joining them without hesitation, without second thought, her boarding pass held lightly in her hand. The same simple action she had taken earlier, and yet it carried a different meaning now. As she moved forward with the line, the scanner beeped again, the same sound, the same motion. But this time, when she stepped through, there was no question in her mind, no hesitation in her step, just a quiet, steady certainty. And as she walked down the jet bridge, the light narrowing into a soft tunnel ahead, the noise fading behind her, Emily Carter carried nothing visible from that moment on the airport floor. No reward, no recognition, just something quieter, something deeper, the knowledge that when it mattered, she had stayed, and that had been enough.